Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our live webinar on cardiovascular pathology. This is our last session of the year, and it's an extremely special one. Today, we have a trio of youthful speakers, and they are Dr. Pranita Zare, who's currently the fellow in cardiovascular pathology at St. GS Medical College and KEM Hospital, Mumbai, India, and Doctors Pawan Daga and Ashutosh Goel, who are interns also at the same institute. The topic for today's talk is Cardiovascular Pathology, Medical Student Edition, Part 1. A slight change from our usual program. We are broadcasting live on both the Mumbai CVP Facebook page and also the Pathology Student Forum Facebook page simultaneously. And we will be accepting questions from the audience through both of these pages. We will not have a panel discussion this time, but we would be more than happy to accept all the questions from our medical students and other viewers through our two Facebook pages. Pranita, I would like to invite you to begin.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. My topic for discussion is atherosclerosis, myocardial infarction, and aortic aneurysm. Atherosclerosis is a chronic vascular disease which involves the intima of elastic and larger muscular arteries and is characterized by fibroinflammatory lipid plaque which protrudes into the lumen. This is the basic structure of an atheromatous plaque, which is composed of smooth muscle cells, macrophages, T lymphocytes, foam cells, collagen, elastin, proteoglycans, and intracellular and extracellular lipid. Modifiable risk factors for atherosclerosis are hyperlipidemia, hypertension, which are the major risk factors, followed by smoking, diabetes mellitus induces hypercholesterolemia, followed by inflammation. Non-modifiable risk factors are family history, increasing age, and gender. Males are more prone as premenopausal women are relatively protected. However, postmenopausal, the risk remains the same. Moving on to pathogenesis, whenever there is an endothelial cell injury or dysfunction, there is recruitment of monocytes and T lymphocytes into the vessel wall. Now, this macrophage and T cells, they secrete cytokines and growth factors which promote the proliferation of smooth muscle cells and their migration from the media into the intima. Circulating LDL is also deposited in the vessel wall, which is oxidized and is taken up by the macrophages, and now these macrophages are known as foam cells. These foam cells although further proliferate the smooth muscle cells, which leads to deposition of collagen and hardening of the vessel wall. Now, these foam cells, they rupture and release their content, and this drives the growth of the plaque. Now, this plaque can ulcerate, rupture, and lead to thrombus formation. This is the intimal aspect of thoracic aorta, showing multiple linear yellowish fatty streaks, which are composed of foamy macrophages. Here you can identify multiple yellowish atheromatous plaques. This aorta shows severe atherosclerosis, and these are the areas of ulceration. Serial sectioning of the aorta show destruction of the intima and media by atheromatosis. All these areas. This is a microscopy from aorta. Here we can identify this is the media. This is a necrotic core, which is showing cholesterol clefts. These are needle-shaped empty spaces which are formed due to washing off of cholesterol during the processing. Clinical consequences of atherosclerotic disease are myocardial infarction, stroke, aortic aneurysm, and peripheral vascular diseases. This is a section from a coronary. This is the adventitia, which is thickened. This is the media, which shows destruction. This is the fibrofatty plaque. Here you can identify the cholesterol clefts. All these are macrophages. And this is an occlusive thrombus. Again, this is a section from coronary. This is a fibrocellular plaque. And the lumen is obliterated by a thrombus. This is a thrombus. Moving on to ischemic heart disease, it is a spectrum of pathophysiologically related syndromes which results from imbalance between the myocardial supply and cardiac demand for the oxygenated blood. IHD presents as the following clinical syndromes: myocardial infarction, angina pectoris, chronic IHD, and sudden cardiac death, out of which we are going to discuss myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction is the death of cardiac muscle, which is due to prolonged severe ischemia. It is diagnosed by clinical features of crushing, squeezing, stabbing chest pain, along with weak, rapid pulse, diaphoresis, nausea, vomiting. Laboratory tests which help to identify cardiac specific proteins, along with ECG changes. The frequency of myocardial infarction rises progressively with age. Moving on to pathogenesis, whenever there is an atheromatous plaque in the coronary artery, it can undergo acute change in the form of intraplaque hemorrhage, ulceration, erosion, or rupture, which exposes the subendothelium, over which platelets adhere, aggregate, and secrete their granular contents, which lead to formation of microthrombi. Now, vasospasm is also stimulated by the mediators which are secreted by the platelets. Tissue factor activates the coagulation pathway, which adds to the bulk of the thrombus. Now the thrombus occludes the vessel lumen within minutes. These are the slices of the transverse section through ventricles. This is the right ventricle. This is the left ventricle. This is the anterior, lateral, and posterior wall of the left ventricle. This is interventricular septum. Here we can identify a reddish discoloration of the myocardium, which is due to the occlusion of the posterior descending artery. This is an acute myocardial infarction. Moving on to microscopy, here what we can see are, these are all cardiomyocytes which have lost their nuclear details. There is interstitial edema along with minimal inflammation. So we can age this infarct as 4 to 12 hours old. Again, here all these cardiomyocytes, they have lost their nuclear details. Interstitium shows florid neutrophilic infiltration. This is a 3 to 5 days old infarct. Here, the macrophages have eaten up all the ischemic cardiomyocytes. On the background, we can identify there are apoptotic bodies. So this is a 7 to 10 days old infarct. This is a healing infarct showing hemosiderophages. These are fibroblasts. There is collagen deposition in the background with minimal chronic inflammation. So this is an healing infarct, which is 10 to 14 days old. Now, what is reperfusion injury? Reperfusion is the restoration of blood flow to the ischemic myocardium, which is threatened by infarction. The ultimate goal is to salvage the cardiac muscle, which is at risk. Though it is beneficial, it induces myocardial death and increase in the size of the infarct, so it is called as reperfusion injury. The prime mechanism of injury is via oxygen-free radicals and calcium influx. Here we can identify ischemic cardiomyocytes, all these, and there is interstitial hemorrhage due to reperfusion. These are intensely eosinophilic intracellular stripes, which are known as contraction band necrosis. These are caused due to exaggerated contraction of the intracellular sarcomere of the damaged cells following reperfusion. Now, what is a no reflow phenomenon? Reperfusion-induced microvascular injury not only induces hemorrhage, but also endothelial swelling that occludes the capillaries and limit the reperfusion of critically injured myocardium. Stunned myocardium is a state of prolonged cardiac failure which is induced by short-term ischemia that recovers within days. Hibernation. When the myocardium is subjected to chronic sublethal ischemia, it enters into a state of lowered metabolism and function. Subsequent revascularization following therapeutic intervention restores the normal function of the hibernating myocardium. Again, these are the slices of the transverse section of heart. This is the right ventricle. This is the left ventricle. This is the posterior wall, where we can identify a grayish fibrous scar, which disappears as we move towards the apex. This is an old healed infarct. Corresponding microscopy shows dense collagenous scar. And these are the residual cardiomyocytes. So this is an old healed infarct, which has to be more than 2 months old. Complications of myocardial infarction are cardiogenic shock, arrhythmias, myocardial rupture, ventricular aneurysm, Dressler's syndrome, infarct expansion, mural thrombi, papillary muscle dysfunction, and chronic IHD. Here we can identify a large clot which seems to be adherent to the heart. After removal of the clot, here is a rupture in the free wall. So this is a picture of free wall rupture, which is a fatal complication of myocardial infarction. It most commonly occurs on the anterior wall at the mid-ventricular level. This is a transverse section through the ventricles. This is the left ventricle. This is the right ventricle. And here there is a mural thrombus, which has been formed due to stasis of blood and endocardial injury. This is a late complication of myocardial infarction, which occurs due to a transmural infarct, which involves the anteroseptal wall. This is a ventricular aneurysm with thrombus in it. Moving on to aneurysms of aorta. Aneurysms are congenital or acquired localized abnormal dilation of blood vessels. True aneurysm involves all the 3 layers of the vessel wall, whereas a false aneurysm or pseudoaneurysm is produced by a gap which leads to the formation of extravascular hematoma which communicates within the lumen. Saccular aneurysm are spherical outpouching which involves a portion of the wall, whereas fusiform aneurysms are circumferential. Etiology of aortic aneurysm. Congenital and hereditary causes are Valsalva sinuses aneurysm, bicuspid aorta, and ascending aortic aneurysms. Aneurysms associated with Marfan syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Acquired causes are atherosclerosis, degenerative changes, inflammatory conditions like Takayasu arteritis, infections, for example, syphilis, and traumatic causes. Moving on to pathogenesis. There is extracellular matrix degradation, which is mediated by the proteolytic enzymes, which are secreted by the inflammatory cells from an atherosclerotic plaque. Poor intrinsic quality of vessel wall connective tissue, as seen in Marfan syndrome and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. An imbalance between collagen degradation and synthesis due to inflammation can produce aneurysm, whereas weakened vascular wall through loss of smooth muscle cells can also produce an aneurysm. Abdominal aortic aneurysms are more common than thoracic aortic aneurysms, and they're associated with atherosclerosis. 80% of them occur between renal arteries and above the aortic bifurcation. They are usually asymptomatic. Complications include rupture, embolization, and infection. Rupture most commonly occurs in the retroperitoneal space, and then the patient can present with tender abdomen, abdominal pain, hypotension, and secondary bacterial infections by Salmonella, Staphylococcus, E. coli can also be seen. This is a massively dilated abdominal aorta with a large aneurysm. This is the thrombus. We can also identify kidneys here. Thoracic aortic aneurysms are associated with hypertension. 60% of them are seen in ascending aorta, 10% in the arch, 40% in the descending thoracic aorta. They present with difficulty in swallowing when there is compression of the esophagus, respiratory difficulty when there is compression of the airways, cough when there is compression of recurrent laryngeal nerve, and pain caused by bone erosion. Complications are rupture, embolization, and infection, same that as of abdominal aortic aneurysm. Moving on to management, aneurysms which are more than 5 cm large are aggressively managed by surgical bypass with a prosthetic graft or endoluminal approach using a stent graft. This aorta shows severe atherosclerosis, and here we can identify a graft in the region of abdominal aorta. Thank you.
Okay, that was wonderful, Pranita. Ashutosh, would you like to continue?
Good evening, everyone. So I will be taking the next session on rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease. Rheumatic fever, it is an immune-mediated disorder. Post a streptococcal throat infection by group A beta hemolytic streptococci, there is an acute multisystemic inflammatory response which is mounted by our immune system against our body tissues. And this is characterized by formation of a granuloma, and recurrent episodes can be seen. It affects children in the age group of 5 to 14 years and is seen more commonly in females. Associated etiology factors include poverty, overcrowding, undernutrition, and improper access to the healthcare. Now let's move on to the pathogenesis. So here you can see it is a group A streptococci. It has multiple proteins like M protein over its surface and a few carbohydrate antigens. So initially it causes a throat infection, due to which the immune system is activated, leading to activation of the monocytes and macrophages cells, which act as the antigen presenting cells. This in turn will activate the CD4 cells, and CD4 cells will activate the other B cells and T cells. Now, in some 3% of susceptible individuals, this M protein have a similar structure to the proteins which are present on the various tissues of our body. Hence, these antibodies which are produced, they cross-react with the antigens present on the tissues. So here you can see this is a tissue and this is the protein over that tissue, and these antibodies are cross-reacting with it. This phenomena is known as molecular mimicry, and it is a type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. So what will it lead to? It will lead to multisystemic response in joints. It will lead to inflammation of the large joints like the knee joint, ankle joint. And this inflammation, it will be of migratory nature. That is, it will involve one joint or the other anytime. Then it can affect heart, leading to carditis. It may be clinical or subclinical. That is, patient might be presenting with symptoms in clinical carditis, or he may not be presenting with symptoms, that it is diagnosed occasionally on echocardiography. Then on skin, there can be some lesions like subcutaneous nodules, which are small lumps which are present in the subcutaneous tissue, or there may be erythema marginatum. These are pink color macules which are present over the limbs and the trunk. And then in brain, it can affect the basal ganglia and can lead to Sydenham's chorea, which is a type of involuntary actions. Clinical features. So the patient will present to us with features like fever, joint pain, swelling, rashes, or involuntary movements. On auscultation, there will be murmur associated with mitral regurgitation, which is a pansystolic murmur. Here in the diagram, you can see there is regurgitation of blood from the ventricle towards the atrium. For diagnosis of rheumatic fever, Jones criteria is used, under which the major criteria include carditis, polyarthritis, Sydenham's chorea, erythema marginatum, subcutaneous nodules, while the minor criteria include fever, monoarthralgia, elevated ESR or CRP, and prolonged PR interval. There should be a documented previous streptococcal infection or a raised ASO titer. If this condition is present, then the diagnosis can be made by either presence of any 2 major criteria or 2 minor with 1 major criteria. Now let's see some pathological features. So since the disease involves all the layers of the heart, hence it can lead to pancarditis. On microscopy, we are able to see Aschoff bodies, which are a foci in which there are T lymphocyte, plasma cells, and some macrophages, which are known as Anish-Cow cells. So here we have a microscopic image. It shows an Ashaw body with multiple small lymphocytic infiltration, and these are the Anish-Cow cells. On cross section, they have an owl eye-like appearance of the nuclei, while on longitudinal section, they have a wavy or ribbon-like appearance. Hence, they are also known as caterpillar cells. This image, it shows fibrinous pericarditis. As you can see, there is a bread and butter appearance of the pericardium. It occurs due to exudation of fluid between the visceral and the parietal pericardium. Thus, we are unable to identify the chambers separately. This image shows myocarditis. There, as you can see, there are myocytes, and in between there is an Ashaw body and interstitial fibrosis. Here are small lymphocytes and macrophages, which we can see. Rheumatic fever also involves valve, and it leads to formation of verrucae, which are wart-like vegetations, and these are present along the lines of closure of the mitral valve. These vegetations occur due to fibrinoid necrosis of the cusps and the tendinous cord. The mitral valve is most commonly involved. Then rheumatic fever can also lead to thickenings in the subendocardial region called as Meckelum plaque. Here in the diagram, we can see there are multiple small vegetations. These are also known as verrucae, and these are present along the lines of closure. And on the posterior aspect of the left atrium, we can see there is a thickening. This is a Meckelum's plaque. Now, the management. So the patients are, if they present acutely, then the treatment is given with benzathine penicillin G, 1.2 lakh international unit. For arthritis, arthralgia, aspirin and NSAIDs can be given. Post an episode of rheumatic fever, the patients are started on prophylaxis therapy of penicillin injection G, penicillin injection, which they have to receive once in every 21 days or 3 weeks. Now, if there are recurrent episodes of rheumatic fever and there is chronic prolongation of the disease, then it results in rheumatic heart disease. Rheumatic heart disease, it accounts for 25 to 45% of all the acquired heart diseases. Hence, it makes it of a public health significance. The most common valvular abnormality seen is that of mitral stenosis, and it can involve other valves like aortic valve, leading to mitral stenosis alone or mitral stenosis with aortic stenosis. Here you can see there is stenosis of the valve and there is accumulation of blood in the left atrium. Now, the pathological features include there is thickening of the valve leaflets, there are fusion of the commissures and the shortening, and the chordae tendineae are also thickened and fused. Here in this image, you can see that the mitral valve, it has thickened, and this anterior mitral valve leaflet, there is thickening of this leaflet, and these commissures, they are fused, and their calcification can also be seen. And these chordae tendineae, they are shortened, and they are also thickening of the chordae tendineae. And these here in the left atrium, there is a jet lesion which we can identify. Now, as we have discussed that rheumatic heart disease lead to mitral stenosis, hence there is accumulation of blood in the left atrium. This can lead to formation of small mural thrombi inside the left atrium, which can embolize and then go to systemic circulation. If it goes to brain, it can lead to stroke. If it goes to lungs, then it can lead to pulmonary embolism. Then, due to accumulation of blood, there is enlargement of the left atrium, leading to atrial fibrillation. And since there is an increase in LA pressure, so it is transmitted backwards via pulmonary vein, and it goes to lungs, leading to exudation of fluids inside the lungs, interstitium, leading to pulmonary edema. And slowly, as the disease progresses, it can go backwards and then affect right ventricle, leading to right ventricular hypertrophy. Hence, the patient will have variable presentations accordingly. So the patient will be managed in the lines of heart failure with like diuretics, antiarrhythmics, and in severe cases, surgical procedures like balloon mitral valvulotomy or mitral valve replacement might have to be done. Thank you.
That was a good job, Ashutosh. Pawan, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. I would be talking about various vegetations that we encounter in the heart. The three chief kind of vegetations that we are going to talk about are
Pawan, I'm sorry to disturb you, but your voice is not very clear.
Is it clear now?
Okay. All right, go ahead, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Pawan, go ahead.
The three chief kinds of vegetations that we encounter in the heart are ones due to infective endocarditis, Liebman-Sachs endocarditis, or non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. We are going to talk infective endocarditis in detail in this session. So what is infective endocarditis? As the name makes it very obvious that it is an infection, so it's infective, and it's an infection of the endocardium of the heart. The endocardium being the innermost layer of the heart, which lines the left atrium, left ventricle, and both the atriums, both the ventricles, and both the walls. Depending upon whether the infection is caused to a biological valve or to a prosthetic valve, we can further divide it into native valve endocarditis. The native valve endocarditis is further divided as subacute, which mostly occurs to an already damaged valve, like a valve due to rheumatic heart disease. And the most common organism involved in that case is Streptococcus viridans. Or acute endocarditis, which can also involve undamaged valves, the normal biological valves, and it is most common implicated because of Staphylococcus aureus. Even prosthetic valve endocarditis can be encountered, and they can be divided into early or late stage prosthetic valve endocarditis, depending upon the time duration after the transplantation of prosthetic valve it was affected. Now, as subacute endocarditis is the most common form of infective endocarditis that we encounter in the clinical setting, we are going to talk about it first. Coming to the pathogenesis of subacute endocarditis, as we have talked earlier, the valves commonly are already damaged in this case. It could be because of any reason, either due to a mechanical cause or due to an autoimmune cause. This damaged valves leads to exposure of certain proteins beneath the endothelium, and that leads to adherence of fibrins and platelet. This fibrins and platelet creates a mesh-like structure which can cause trapping of circulating bacteria. And in subacute endocarditis, the most common bacteria that is trapped is Streptococcus viridans. Once the bacteria are trapped, they have enough supply of blood and oxygen with nutrients. Hence, that leads to rapid proliferation of pathogens, and then further inflammation leads to deposition of fibrins, and the vegetations continue to grow. These vegetations that continue to grow also causes inflammation and destruction of normal architecture of the valve, and that lead to valvular destruction and can lead to regurgitation of flow from the ventricles to the atria. This is a schematic diagram of the pathogenesis that we just talked right now. Here, if we can see that the endothelium is already damaged, and this leads to deposition of platelet and fibrins here that creates a mesh-like structure. These yellow round bodies represent bacteria. This bacteria then gets trapped into this mesh-like structure, and it leads to inflammation and release of cytokines, which recruits various inflammatory cells like monocytes, and this causes a cascade of inflammation. Coming to the gross morphology of the heart in infective endocarditis, here we can see on the above part of the picture is left atrium, and below it is left ventricle, and separating it is the mitral valve, which has been cut here. The mitral valve is affected, the normal architecture of the mitral valve is destroyed by this growing vegetation. And if we can look closely, these chordae are shortened and thickened as well, where there is also papillary muscle hypertrophy. This is a classic case of rheumatic heart disease, and there is involvement of mitral valve over the due to infective endocarditis over rheumatic heart disease. So this is a subacute kind of endocarditis, and mitral valve is the most common overall valve involved in it. Coming to the microscopy, As we have seen in the schematic diagram, there is deposition of fibrin. Because of the inflammation, there is recruitment of inflammatory cells and the microorganisms that we can see under the microscope. Because subacute endocarditis can lead to chronic inflammation, certain features such as granulation tissue ingrowth, which has new vessels in it, and chronic inflammatory cells can be seen. There is ingrowth of fibroblast and deposition of collagen that can lead to fibrosis, and gradual deposition of calcium that can lead to calcification as well. In this picture, we can see there is bacterial colonies that are growing within the endothelium of the valves, and it is leading to destruction of the overlying endocardium. Coming to the pathogenesis of acute endocarditis. Now remember, acute endocarditis do not need an already damaged valve so that it can take place. An acute endocarditis can occur on the normal valves as well. If there is any inflammation anywhere in the body, it can lead to activation of endothelial cells. And just the activation of endothelial cells can lead to expression of integrins over the endothelial cells that can lead to local deposition of a protein named fibronectin. Now this fibronectin, Staphylococcus aureus can adhere on it and then can continue to grow. The further pathway of acute endocarditis is similar to subacute endocarditis. Once Staphylococcus adheres to fibronectin, it can lead to proliferation of pathogens and laying down of further fibrin and creation of a mesh-like structure which grows into a vegetation. This vegetation again destroys the wall leaflet and can lead to regurgitation. This is a schematic diagram representing acute endocarditis. If we see here, this valvular endothelium, it's not completely destroyed, it is still intact, but these are activated endothelial cells, and that they represent they express certain proteins known as integrins, and the fibronectin is deposited over it. The Staphylococcus aureus, which is represented by yellow small bodies, are adhered on the fibronectin, and that lead to a cascade of inflammation and recruitment of inflammatory cells. This is a gross specimen of acute endocarditis. If you compare this specimen with the previous specimen, you can see the vegetations here are very bulky. They look friable, they are very bulky, and there are multiple distinct regions that are involved in this case. And these friable bulky vegetations can even dislodge from the endocardium and can go anywhere else in the body. They can also involve more than one valve at a time. Now, if we see here, this is the cut section again of the left side of the heart. If you see the valve, this valve is relatively spared as compared to the previous gross specimens that we saw. But here the endocardium, the mural endocardium is involved, leading to a single distinct vegetation over here. So not necessarily only valves are involved, but mural endocardium can also be involved in infective endocarditis. Now, there are certain other risk factors and special situations in which special organisms are involved. We will talk about this now. Now, the most common overall cause, as we have studied before, is Streptococcus viridans. But there are other certain factors as well, like poor dental hygiene. Streptococcus viridans is one of the common commensal of the oral cavity. And because if there is poor dental hygiene, the Streptococcus viridans can grow in large number, and any dental manipulation can lead to Streptococcus viridans bacteremia. And native damaged valve is necessary for Streptococcus viridans to attach to the valvular endocardium. And native undamaged valves and intravenous drug abusers commonly have infective endocarditis due to Staphylococcus aureus. Now, in intravenous drug abusers, until now, we have seen the left side of the heart to be commonly involved. But in intravenous drug abusers, the most common side of the heart that is involved is right side, because the veins, the Staphylococcus aureus that is injected into the veins first travel to the right side of the heart before reaching to the left side of the heart. In case of prosthetic heart valves, Staphylococcus epidermidis is commonly involved because it has the special property of forming a biofilm on the prosthetic materials. In case of indwelling urinary catheters, example of which would be patients that are staying in ICU for a long time and we have to put urinary catheter for a long time. enterococci can grow over those catheters and can lead to bacteremia and infective endocarditis. If there are ulcerative lesions in the colon, for example, due to ulcerative colitis or colon cancer, it can lead to Streptococcus bovis endocarditis because it is a common commensal of the distal gut of our body. Coming to the clinical features, patient commonly present with fever, but this fever could be absent in subacute endocarditis, or the fever could be very high and could be accompanied with chills in acute infective endocarditis. There could be constitutional symptoms as well, like fatigue and weight loss, and abdominal discomfort can be seen due to splenomegaly. Clinical signs that we see are splinter hemorrhages. These splinter hemorrhages are reddish hemorrhages that are seen on the nail bed of the patient, or we can see tender nodules over the pulp of the fingers, which are known as Osler's node. Other clinical signs like Janeway lesions, which are erythematous, non-painful lesions seen on palms or soles of the feet. And other signs such as splenomegaly can be seen more commonly in subacute kind of infective endocarditis. Now, there are complications such as cardiac complications and non-cardiac complications that can be seen in infective endocarditis. The cardiac complications involve perforation. Remember, this is a chronic inflammatory process. So the wall of the heart can be weakened quite a lot. And because of the high pressure, especially in the left side of the heart, it can lead to perforation. If the infection ingrows in the myocardium and it completely surrounds the wall, then it can lead to a ring abscess formation and myocardial abscess formation as well. If the vegetations are very bulky and friable, they can dislodge from the endocardium of the heart and can get attached to anywhere else in the body, which can lead to thromboembolism and disruption of the blood supply to that particular region or organ. If it involves the conduction system of the heart, it can lead to arrhythmia. If it involves the vessels of the heart in the myocardium, then it can lead to myocardial infarction as well. There are certain non-cardiac complications as well, such as infarctions. Remember, due to bulky friable vegetations getting dislodged, it can lead to digital infarction or it can lead to stroke as well. Because those thrombus also have bacteria in them, it can lead to metastatic abscesses as well, along with thromboembolism. There is splenomegaly. Because it's a chronic inflammation, there is formation of various antibodies which reacts with antigen, and it can lead to vasculitis. The vasculitis can manifest in the form of glomerulonephritis, which again we see clinically as hematuria or albuminuria, or we can see as Roth spots. Roth spots are seen in the retina during fundoscopic examination, and they are visible as irregular red area with central white dot. Coming to investigations, because the infective endocarditis can lead to transient intermittent bacteremia, blood cultures are an integral part of the diagnosis of infective endocarditis. It also leads to increase in the white blood cell count, can lead to anemia, and to visualize the vegetations, we commonly perform echocardiography. And if we need a more sensitive test, transesophageal echocardiography is preferred. This is a modified Duke's criteria that the clinicians use to definitively diagnose infective endocarditis. I will give a brief overview of this criteria. So it is divided into two parts, the major criteria and the minor criteria. The major criteria has positive blood culture and evidence of endocardial involvement. This evidence of endocardial involvement can be taken as positive findings in echocardiogram or new valvular regurgitation. And minor criteria has 5 features that needs to be fulfilled. Coming to treatment, as it is an infection, we commonly treat it with empiric antibiotics that are commonly given with an intravenous route. But if there are presence of cardiac complications like heart failure or complete valvular destruction, or there are just some organisms that are completely difficult to treat or very resistant, then surgery needs to be performed. Now, this was all about infective endocarditis. There are some other uncommon causes of vegetations as well. The first of which we are going to study is non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. Non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis is also known as merantic endocarditis because it is commonly seen in merantic patients. Merantic representing chronic debilitated patients, those that are suffering from chronic severe diseases and such as cancers, and hence this type of vegetations are commonly seen as a paraneoplastic syndrome. Paraneoplastic syndrome in the tumors such as adenocarcinomas of colon and pancreas. Those adenocarcinomas produce a substance known as mucin. This mucin makes the blood hypercoagulable, and that leads to formation of thrombus. Hence it is called as, and it is not an infective cause. So it's a non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. But not just the cancers that produce mucin, any other hypercoagulable states, for example, hyperestrogenic states, even that can lead to formation of non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. These are sterile, these are non-destructive vegetations that are present most commonly on the mitral wall. But these vegetations can serve as a nidus for infection and can transform into an infective endocarditis. The microscopy of merantic endocarditis. Now here if we see, this is the thrombus that is attached to the valvular surface. Now if we see the valvular microscope, the microscopy of the valve is completely normal. There is no inflammation. There is no destruction of the overlying endocardium. And this thrombus is just loosely attached. Because of this loose attachment, it commonly leads to thromboembolism. The last kind of vegetation that we are going to learn is Libman-Sachs endocarditis. This is associated with SLE, which is systemic lupus erythematosus. It is an autoimmune disease commonly seen in middle-aged females. These are also sterile vegetations. And as we know that in SLE, there are various kinds of autoantibodies that are formed in the body. These autoantibodies react with autoantigens and leads to formation of immune complexes. These immune complexes gets deposited on the endocardium and leads to inflammation. And this inflammation leads to formation of the sterile vegetation. They are commonly located on the mitral surface and the chordae. This can also produce mitral regurgitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pawan. I would like to congratulate our three young speakers on doing a very good job. I think there's only one question from the audience, and that is on the gross findings in reperfusion injury. And I'm actually going to direct this question to the faculty. So if someone would like to answer that.
Can I say a few words?
Yes, ma'am, of course.
I think personally, I don't think grossly you can make out between reperfusion injury and acute myocardial infarction at whatever stage it may be. But microscopically, there are some changes which are described because reperfusion injury occurs after the myocardial infarction has happened, and it is due to opening up of the occluded coronary arteries. And therefore, there is perfusion into the myocardium, which unfortunately is injurious to the myocardium. So the subtle differences are that with a regular myocardial infarction, you have more neutrophilic inflammatory infiltrate, while with reperfusion injury, you may not get that many neutrophils. And then if you do the various, see troponin levels, etc. are higher with a myocardial infarction than in with reperfusion injury. Then things like cytochrome and interleukins, etc., are more in reperfusion injury than in the actual myocardial infarction. So these are some microscopic and subtle. See, reperfusion injury, the death is due to apoptosis. So the inflammatory response is not so vivid as you would get in a myocardial infarction, but grossly it would be very difficult to make out that this is a reperfusion injury or is it a acute myocardial infarction?
Thank you so much for that, Deshpande Madam.
Welcome.
I just wondered, it's like if you can think of any other points which a medical student should know and which may have been missed during the talk, maybe you could summarize some of those points, ma'am, if at all anything has been missed.
In cases of endocarditis, you described various bacteria, Streptococcus viridans, and all those things. In some of the immunosuppressed patients, you sometimes get even fungal bodies, fungal infection. That's not uncommon if patients have been on steroids for a long time, there have been cases of renal failure, etc., then you may come across fungal endocarditis. So that is one thing that has to be kept in mind. And clinical suspicion is extremely important because you could do a blood culture and pick up the organisms and give the appropriate treatment for that particular infection, so that it's not totally unsalvageable as we can put it. An infective endocarditis causes much more destruction of the valves than the non-infective endocarditis.
Thank you, ma'am.
If any of the other faculty members would like to, mention any points which may have been missed during the talks.
Pranita, in your talk on aneurysms.
I think I would like to really congratulate the three young speakers for doing a fantastic job. I think they kind of covered the whole, topic which they had chosen to talk on. So congratulations. I think they covered it up very well. So
I agree with Gayatri that it was a wonderful presentation. Coming to Pranita, I just wanted to add, would you add dissection of the aorta also as an aneurysm, or would you deal with it separately, dissecting aneurysms of aorta, or is it just dissection of the aorta?
Ma'am, maybe we can include that topic in the next session when we are going to include aortic dissection.
Okay, fine, that's fine.
Yeah, we can discuss it then.
Okay. It's a very good job done by all three of you, and congratulations.
We've been working very hard for several months, so I would like to congratulate them.
In cardiac pathology.
Good. I have few words to say. I would like to congratulate all the three speakers who have done very good job. Good. Then one thing, so while reading infective endocarditis, we always say that the organisms will cause or colonize and it causes septic emboli. But most of the times when you're dealing with alive patients, so by the time you get the specimen, they operate. They don't operate in acute scenario. So by that time you get the specimen, most of these people, they would have already received antibiotics. So it is actually very difficult to demonstrate organisms in a clinically suspected case of infective endocarditis when you get the valve specimens. So organisms would have already disappeared. Okay, so the only thing is how you can identify the organisms, either when there is clinical mismatch. So we had two patients where there was candidal endocarditis. They were giving antibacterials, but the valve was showing full colonies of candida. So this kind of situation. So you need to perform both the bacterial stains and fungal stains when you receive any kind of valve vegetations, gram stains, and fungus PAS D and silver methenamine stain has to be performed to identify the organisms. Okay, and most of the times when they send the sample for culture, you will get the results, the definitive type. This thing you should remember. Rest is all fine.
So, talking again about fungal organisms, it's like candida tends to be on the surface.
That's true.
Other hyphal fungi, they tend to be invasive. They're angioinvasive, so they invade the blood vessels and they go deep into the myocardium. So where it is located, if it's like kind of protruding outwards, it's more likely to be Candida. And if it's kind of, invading down, then it's more likely to be a hyphal fungus. Anyway, that was just an interesting. All right.
Thank
So
you,
if there are any more comments, I don't think we have a lot of questions today.
Yeah, one thing. So Ashutosh and Pawan, do you know why there is chances of infective endocarditis is more common in intravenous drug abusers? What is the reason?
Because Staphylococcus, first reason that intravenous drug abusers could be immunocompromised due to various, due to HIV, or second, Staphylococcus aureus is also a skin commensal, so it could be introduced while injecting drugs or while
that is the one. Immunocompromise will come later. They all practice unhygienic practices, so that is the main reason.
All right. So, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. So we'll be coming back in February with part 2, which will, deal with cardiomyopathies and congenital heart disease for medical school students. And in the meanwhile, this is the last session of this year. So we come back on the 9th of January with, a collaborative talk between the Mumbai CVP interest group and the AECVP, which is the Association for European Cardiovascular Pathology. So the first lecture as a part of that collaboration will be by Dr. Christina Basso. And Madam is an eminent speaker, and she's going to be talking about sudden cardiac death in the young. So we are very excited about that. So we hope that everyone will come back for that session as well. So I think, that's it for now. So goodbye, Happy New Year, and see you in 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.